Fertilizing plants is like houseplant care 3.0, not because it's challenging to do, but because it's easy to forget to do, or sometimes we actually don't know where to start. But I asked a bunch of you what your fertilizing questions are, and I got a lot of great responses, so I'm going to read some here. Cowboy Blue Blurp asks, can you talk about the different types of fertilizing? And City Life Stevie inquires, can you touch on more organic or household fertilizers like crushed eggshells, which you'll see I have some right here as well. And then Barb Murphy adds, take us through the fertilizing steps. Do I water first and then fertilize? Now these are all excellent questions, and I will try to answer all of these and more throughout this film. So let's talk about what a fertilizer is in the first place. You can think of a fertilizer more as a multivitamin for your plant because the plant gets its food from the sun. So that's how it photosynthesizes. It's not just reliant on the sun to fulfill its full life cycle. It needs other nutrients as well. And that's part of what fertilizers actually provide plants. So why do houseplants need fertilizer in the first place? Now, if we think of the outdoor environment, you have so many different types of things that are happening outdoors. You have soil that's being made, you have leaves dropping to the ground, you have beautiful earthworms underneath the soil, you have helpful bacteria and helpful fungus, and that's all happening in the environment outside. But when we're talking about inside, when we're working with generally sterile potting mixes, all of that kind of microbial activity, leaves falling onto the soil surface, that's not happening for these plants. They're not getting some nutrients being dropped down through the rainwater, through the leaves, through the forest canopy. So that is something that you actually have to recreate in your home to the greatest extent. And that's why we have fertilizers to help. And again, most of these fertilizers don't have all the macro and micronutrients that plants need, but by using a collection of different organic and synthetic fertilizers, we could get that as close to the outside environment as possible. So you should be fertilizing your plants during the growing season because when your plant is not growing, it's not going to need those extra multivitamins. So I'm here in the Northeast and my growing season is spring, summer, and fall because in the winter months, most of my plants actually go dormant. But if you're somebody who lives in the subtropical and tropical zones of the world, then your growing season will be all year round. So you're going to be fertilizing all year round. Now, when you fertilize, spring is really just the start of the season, and you'll observe this in your plants. I know that towards the end of the spring and going into summer, my plants start to become Herculean. They really start to grow. So as they're just starting to grow in the spring, it's important to have a gentler fertilizer. So if you're using a synthetic fertilizer, which we'll get to in a second, I usually tell people to cut that by half, especially early in the season and late during the fall as it's going into its dormancy. And again, we'll touch upon this a little bit more about when and why to fertilize. Now I have a collection of plants that are up here right now. I have 2 begonias here in the back. I have a tillandsia. I have a collection of succulents planted here. I have a huernia, which is a type of succulent that is related to Hoyas. And I have another leafy variety of plant called Signonium. And we'll be touching upon different fertilizing schedules for each of these plants as well. We had a lot of questions on when to fertilize plants and the frequency of fertilizing plants. Now that is really dependent on the plant species that is in question. And in my Houseplant Masterclass, I have a general guideline of 300 different types of plants that you could refer to. And when I say a guide, I want you to know that this is more of a guide and don't take it as gospel. So when you read different kind of fertilizing regimes online or even in the Houseplant Care Guide, you might see that some say, oh, a balanced fertilizer, or this one should be a 20-10-10 or a 10-10-10. And again, we'll go over what those numbers mean in a second. But just take that more as guidance to provide a schedule for you in order to be able to observe what your plants need. Now, I took this begonia out of my vertical swing garden because this is something that not only one is outgrowing its pot and I need to actually remove this from my vertical swing garden and put it somewhere else, but I've also noticed that the leaves are starting to look a little yellow down below, and this plant definitely is in need of some fertilizer. So that's something that I'm going to do today and to show you how to actually fertilize not only this plant, but some of the other plants that I have showcased here. So let's talk about the different kinds of fertilizers on the market. Now, I don't have every single type of fertilizer here, but there's liquid fertilizers, which actually could be organic or synthetic. And I actually do prefer my liquid fertilizers because it's easy to mix into my water and put into my regular watering regime when it comes to my plants. There is foliar spray liquid as well, such as this, which I use for my tillandsia. There's more granular varieties, which I often find and see that growers are using. This one is also a water soluble, but it's granular, but it's water soluble, so you put it in the water and then it just dissolves. And then, of course, you have these sticks, and these could also be kind of organic or synthetic fertilizers that you stick very close to the stem of the plant, and then they eventually dissolve over time. So these are an example of a slow-release fertilizer. Then you also have soil amendments. Now, these aren't technically fertilizers per se because fertilizers have a lot of regulations. If you say that something is a fertilizer, you have to guarantee the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium or micronutrients or other macronutrients that are listed on the bottle. And oftentimes when you're working with organic amendments, so these are amendments similar to like eggshells, or if you use vermicompost, which is like a worm compost, you can't necessarily guarantee an exact NP or K, nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium ratio, or macro or micronutrient ratios, because varies depending on the types of inputs that you're giving it. So you can't technically consider these fertilizers, even though they might be fertilizing your plant over time. And again, that is something that we'll cover a little bit more deeply later in this video. Now, there has been a number of queries about organic amendments and fertilizing your plants, and I have a couple of them here. So this is called buffalo loam, and you can see that it doesn't have fertilizer at all on the description of this. This is called organic plant food loose compost tea, and compost tea is something that we could actually make in our home if we actually do composting or vermicomposting. These sticks are actually not synthetic. They are vermicompost sticks, so they are an organic amendment. And I have some examples of crushed eggshells, which I have a ton of because I take care of chickens, including Kippy, and they also like to eat their own eggshells for a calcium supplement, which is another type of nutrient that plants use. I do have, however, a word of caution if you are using organic amendments in the home. And this is more because they bring on, I've found, at least a presence of fungus gnats, which I never thought fungus gnats were such a huge nuisance until I got so many queries from all of you saying, what are these tiny little flies that are flying into my nose holes and my eyes and are all around my plants? And some of you actually think that they're more like vinegar flies or anything along those lines. Those are called fungus gnats, and that is a topic of discussion that I have covered in one of my first YouTube videos that I will actually link to above and below, and that I will surely be covering again because there are other solutions in order to be able to keep fungus gnats at bay. But if you are somebody who likes to use vermicompost, and I had used some of my vermicompost and put that on the top and use that as a slow release, fertilizer, if you will, on my plants. But those organic amendments are a surefire way to be able to attract fungus gnats. So let's talk a little bit more about what's on the bottle of a fertilizer. And I think this is really encapsulated so well through Nina Soderlund's question here. I would like to have the ratios in fertilizers explained more deeply, like why 2-2-2 or 10-5-3, for example. And what is the difference between an organic and a non-organic or synthetic fertilizer? Why are their ratios so different? And what does it mean if it's a gentle fertilizer, which is it's a term that I often use. And lastly, what is in the rest of the bottle? Is it just water? Nina, those are all excellent questions, and I'm going to cover every single one of those in the video. So let's talk about what those ratios, those numbers, which she referred to as like 222 or 1053, for example, actually represent. So you could see on the back of any of these bottles, or even on the front, you'll see this is Spoma Organic is 222 as an indoor organic fertilizer. This one right here with the Bonnie liquid plant food is 10-10-10. This Jax is 20-20-20. And for example, this Organic Neptune's Harvest is 231. And this Tillandsia food is 17-8-22. So those ratios are essentially nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the N, P, and K values. And that is essentially the percentage of each of those macronutrients by weight of the solution that they are in. So if something is 10-10-10, that means it's a balanced fertilizer of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and that is the weight in relation to what is in the rest of the bottle. So one of Nina's questions was, what is in the rest of the fertilizer bottle? So if this is 10-10-10 by weight of this, then what is the rest of the solution in here? And the answer is it's just filler. So yes, it could actually be water. It could be a lot of materials that just have no effect on the plant. So that's why some people actually want to go with a more concentrated granules that they could mix in with the water, because otherwise you're just paying primarily for water or filler in a bottle. So that is something to take into consideration when you are actually buying fertilizer in the store. Organic fertilizers essentially means that they are coming from organic sources, whereas a synthetic or non-organic fertilizer is synthesized in a lab. So if you're synthesizing something in a lab, you could concentrate it more and get a higher number. So things that you see like a 10-10-10, like this Bonnie's fertilizer, or this Jax fertilizer, which is a 20-20-20, or even this Tillandsia food, which is 17-8-22, is most likely a synthetic fertilizer because those are relatively high numbers. Organic fertilizers generally have smaller ratios of those numbers. So in the case of this Organic Neptune's, it's 2-3-1. And this is a fertilizer that is based off of seaweed. So again, an organic source, and it's again much gentler. So Nina, I hope that answers your question as far as what's the difference between an organic and a synthetic fertilizer, and what does a gentle fertilizer mean? In the case of the indoor plant food for a Spoma, this is a 2-2-2. The cacti fertilizer is a 1-2-2. So generally cacti fertilizers I've found, or succulent fertilizers, are usually lower in the nitrogen and a little bit higher up on the phosphorus and the potassium. So you'll often see like a 2-4-7 or sometimes a 3-4-7 or a 0-1-1. In this case, it's a 1-2-2. And in the case of this orchid, or sometimes you'll find African violet bloom boosters, they have a little bit of a higher p-value. And again, these are, I'm going to go over a little bit shortly by using some of these as an example. So this orchid fertilizer is actually a 1-3-1. So again, just recapping there so I didn't actually lose you, the difference between a synthetic and organic fertilizer is that an organic fertilizer is using organic materials, whereas a synthetic fertilizer is synthesized in a lab, so you could actually concentrate those a bit more, and that results in higher numbers. So what I often tell people, that if you're going with the synthetic fertilizer route, always cut that by half. So it might say, oh, this requires half a teaspoon per gallon of water, and I always cut it by half, so about a 1/4 teaspoon per gallon of water, because it is so easy to over-fertilize your plants. Your plants only need small, minute amounts of that multivitamin in order to be able to complete its life cycle. And if you're over-fertilizing, it will actually prevent them from taking up other nutrients that you might be trying to provide it in the soil. So especially if you're fertilizing them in the beginning of this growing season, like I said, in the early spring and also in the fall as it's waning into winter, you definitely want to be cutting that by half if you're using synthetic fertilizer. Now, if you're using an organic fertilizer, these fertilizers are really gentle. You don't have to cut those by half because they are already very low. And if you see something that's guiding you to use a well-balanced synthetic fertilizer like a 10-10-10 on a monthly basis, then if you're using really just a 1-1-1 or 2-2-2, for example, you might want to be increasing your fertilizer maybe to a weekly to a bi-weekly basis, if you catch my drift, just because you don't have to fertilize as frequently if you're using something that is a little bit of a higher NPK value. And if you're using something with a lower NPK value, you might want to increase the rate that you're actually fertilizing your plant. But again, like watering, it's better to be able to observe what your plant needs. And like I said, with this begonia hispida that I've been growing, I've noticed this is an incredible grower. It is just outgrowing its pot and its planter. And I am not only going to need to replant this into a larger pot, but I am also going to need to give it some fertilizer really soon because I've noticed that the green on its leaves started to look, I don't know, it's just starting to look a little bit more lackluster. So what am I going to do with this? I'm going to fertilize it. And because begonias are largely grown for their foliage, now they do flower, and their flowers are beautiful, I would say giving it a well-balanced fertilizer, like a 10-10-10 or a 2-2-2, depending on if you want to go synthetic or organic. Or if you know that it's about to bloom, you might even want to give it a little bit of a bloom booster, so a little bit higher in the phosphorus. But that nitrogen value is important in order to be able to help the plant photosynthesize. So sometimes foliage plants that are not really grown for their flower, like the syngonium, is going to require a little bit more of nitrogen. So you could oftentimes give these plants something a little bit higher in nitrogen, like a 20-10-10 or a 2-1-1, for example, again, if you're going the organic route. Or you could just give it more of a well-balanced fertilizer. So it's really up to you, and you could see how quickly your plant is growing because it's probably going to be using those macro and micronutrients relatively quickly. Now, as far as the rest of the values go of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, if you have a plant that flowers and is grown for their flowers, you might want to up the phosphorus value because phosphorus is used in bud and flower formation. So if you have an African violet, for instance, or if you have an orchid, that's why these fertilizers are called more bloom boosters. That's why if you turn it over, you'll see that it's 1-3-1 and there's more in that phosphorus value because that has more input into growing the buds and the flowers within the plants. Now, potassium in general is just for healthy plants. It helps create a sturdier plant, and it helps also in disease prevention. So if you have a plant that is prone to disease, then I would highly encourage you to be proactive in being able to fertilize your plant during the growing season. Now, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is not the only nutrients that plants need. There are other macro and micronutrients that those plants need in order to be able to fulfill their life cycle, and that is something that I go way more deeply into, including the deficiency that plants exhibit without those micro and macronutrients in the Houseplant Masterclass. So if you want to dive more deeply into that, then you could go to houseplantmasterclass.com. But for this basics video, I'm only going to be concentrating on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and touching a little bit upon the other macro and micronutrients. One thing that I really want to reiterate when it comes to fertilizing is less is more. I mean, oftentimes when we think of like, oh, we're giving our plant a multivitamin, you want to be able to douse it with lots of fertilizer, but that is only going to burn the plant. As I'd mentioned earlier, plants only require minute amounts of this stuff. So you want to be very frugal when it comes to fertilizing your plant. And we'll get to shortly how to actually fertilize these plants. But let's just look a little bit more closely on each of these fertilizers, because I think that sometimes we want to follow the messaging on the bottle, and that's not always great to do. And for instance, and I don't mean to pick on this one, but this is Bonnie's Liquid Plant Food. It's a balanced fertilizer. It says 10-10-10, so that means nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But I had to laugh at this because it says feed every time you water your plant. And I think that's a little bit presumptuous, because in many cases, if some of my plants are in my southwest facing window, which gets an intense amount of light, I often find myself watering my plants sometimes 3-4 times a week even, especially in the summer months. And that would be a lot of time fertilizing my plants. Not to mention that a lot of the plants in my southwest facing window are succulents and cacti, which require such small amounts of fertilizer. As a matter of fact, I'm growing this Huernia, which again, as I mentioned, it's in the Hoya family, and I noticed it's about to bloom, and I will probably only fertilize this once per year, so once annually. And I'm probably going to give it less of a cacti fertilizer and more of a bit of a bloom booster, just to help with the bloom that is about to burst open on this one. As well as these succulents. You know, these I'm not fertilizing as regularly, maybe on a monthly, even sometimes bi-monthly basis. So this one I kind of feel is a little presumptuous. So if you're going to use something like this, which is a synthetic fertilizer, then I would cut it by half, and I would disregard the feed every time that you water and go species by species with your plant as to when is going to be the best time to water that plant and fertilize that plant. And again, I have a helpful guide, a 300 houseplant care spreadsheet in the Houseplant Masterclass. And if you sign up for my email, I have a 30 plant care spreadsheet there. And if you buy my book, How to Make a Plant Love You, then you'll get also a 50 care plant spreadsheet before the pre-order is done. So let's go to Jack's, because this is also a synthetic fertilizer, because as we know, it has this higher rate of NPK value, which is 20-20-20. But what's interesting about this one is that it says right below it, with micronutrients, which is great because a lot of synthetic fertilizers don't always have micronutrients. So if I turn this on the back here, I could see it also has boron, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. And these are all very integral to the existence of plants and to help a plant through its life cycle. These are just a small selection of micronutrients that a plant needs, but I love the fact that Jack took the time to put micronutrients, which is great. I don't even know if the guy's name is Jack, but Jack's, I meant the brand. And as far as organic fertilizers go, oftentimes organic fertilizers will have micronutrients, but they won't be listed on the bottle. And the reason for that is because when you are using organic ingredients, as I mentioned before, it's very difficult to guarantee that it has a certain amount of micronutrients. But if you turn on the back of any of these organic fertilizers by Espoma, you'll also see, in addition to the N, P, and K, in this case, this one also has calcium, which you could get from eggshells. It also has some really helpful bacteria, so a lot of bacillus, which is found in soil and is helpful for plants, and also trichoderma. Now, if you're not familiar with trichoderma, it is a type of fungus that actually forms a symbiosis with plant roots and helps in disease prevention. So that is awesome that a lot of these organic brands are incorporating some of these helpful prebiotics and fungal symbioses with the plants. And that brings me to the next statement of organic versus synthetic fertilizer. What is better? So plants don't really recognize whether you're giving them a synthetic or organic fertilizer. However, if you're trying to build up all those helpful microbes in your container, then you might want to stick to organic fertilizers, because synthetic fertilizers really don't help build that up for those organisms. So let's actually start fertilizing some of these plants. Now you'll notice I have a gallon jug of water here, and the reason why I do that is that I don't often know exactly how much water that I'm putting in my watering can, but in a gallon jug that you know that you have a gallon of water in a gallon jug. So I'm going to use some of the organic fertilizers here by Espoma. And these, again, are just kind of 2-2-2. So again, a really gentle fertilizer. And all you need to do is shake it up a little bit. And it's about 4 pours per gallon. So that's what I'm going to do here. And again, each one of these might have a different set of criteria. So just because I'm pouring 4 of these in here, it doesn't mean I would pour 4 of these in here. You just have to read the back, and then again, if you're using synthetic, to cut that by half. So I'm just going to give this a little shake. And now I'll pour this into my watering can. All right, so the way that you want to fertilize is to do it while you're watering your plants. So I do have a question here of, when should I actually fertilize? Do I fertilize after I water it or during when I water it? And so I would say during watering your plant, but you have to make sure that you water that plant thoroughly. And again, this goes back to how to water a plant episode, which I'll link to above and below as well. But watering your plant thoroughly is important because your plants not only drink the water, but they take up the micro and macronutrients through their root tips and through their root hairs. So you don't want the plant actually having all of that fertilizer too superficially next to the parts of their roots that are not going to be taking up those macro and micronutrients anyway. What would happen then is that you're going to actually be burning the plant, and that actually could kill your plant as well. So what I'm going to do here with this begonia, which has only been fertilized once this season, is just to water it pretty thoroughly all the way around. And it's taking the plant a little while to soak all the way through. See a little spider who's running for his life here as well. And so that's just soaking down, and I want to make sure that it's going to be as thorough as possible. What I'm looking out for is just a little bit of water in the base of this plant. And while that one's taking its dear time walking down through the soil, I'm going to water this begonia hispida, again really thoroughly, and wait for that to go all the way down. So you want to make sure that you're getting that fertilizer all the way down to the root tips and the root hair in order for those micro and macronutrients to get all the way up into the tips of the plant. And the larger the plant, the quicker that it's growing, the more it's going to be taking on those micro and macronutrients. Same thing here with this plant. This is my syngonium, and again, because this one is primarily grown for its foliage more than its flowers, you might decide to have something that's a little bit higher in the nitrogen. Right now, I'm just giving it a balanced fertilizer. So I just have this, it's poured out into the basin, maybe a little bit too much, and I'm going to pour this out into my sink because you don't want your plant sitting in that. And the reason for that is if it's taking up this water with all that excess salts, then you could actually be burning your plant. I see just a little bit of water that's come through the base here and just a little bit of water that has come through the base here. So those would be perfect pours and what I would consider a thorough watering of these plants. Now, what about foliar feeding? Because I know I had some questions there. And a tillandsia is a great example of a foliar feeder because it has no roots. Even the roots that it does have, it doesn't use it to really take up nutrients. It uses it more to kind of cling to trees. So how you want to foliar feed this is not by spraying it with the direct fertilizer, but either soaking it or misting it with water thoroughly first, and then allowing the plant stomata to really open up, and then accept a few squirts of the tillandsia fertilizer mix. Now, I also sometimes will soak this in water, usually not this one because I don't have a big enough vessel to soak this one, but some of the smaller tillandsias I'll soak in clear glass, and I will have filtered water or distilled water, and then I'll put in some drops of this and kind of shake it up and let them sit in that. So they actually are getting their fertilizer while they're soaking up their water. And the reason for that is the way that these guys work in nature is that they are in these treetops, and as the rain comes down, it washes this, almost like this compost tea, really. It washes all these nutrients off the leaf some of the rainwater has these micro and macronutrients, and the plant is absorbing that foliarly. So most plants I would not suggest feeding foliarly because a lot of plants with roots are taking up those nutrients through their roots, and their leaves are less designed to be able to take up nutrients. So foliar feeding all of your other plants is probably going to be a waste. I'd stick to ones that focus on the roots. Now, what happens if you don't have a Tillandsia fertilizer like this for a spray bottle? Well, you know what? It's very easy to make a dilute solution of fertilizer, whether it's gentle fertilizer or something a little bit closer to the NPK value of this foliar feed, and just actually reduce the amount of it, put it in a spray bottle, a clean out spray bottle that you have in your home, and you could have your own Tillandsia fertilizer. So one of the last sections that I'd like to go over today is when not to fertilize your plant. And I think the first point I'd like to make is encapsulated in a story of a friend who I had gone over to their house, and she had mentioned that her succulents hadn't been doing well and had died recently. Now, mind you, these succulents were on the interior of her space, not next to any type of light source, so that is probably what started to kill these plants. But she said, well, I fertilized it thinking that the fertilizer would actually revive the plants, and instead the plants actually died quicker. And that is one thing that I want to share with you, is that if your plant is at death's doorstep, then do yourself a favor and don't fertilize it, because fertilizing that plant will only make it suffer even more. You really want to diagnose the plant and why it was suffering in the first place, and it's not always because of a micro or macronutrient deficiency. Now, it could be that the plant is exhibiting signs of stress and it is because of micro or macronutrient deficiencies. And that is something that I go over more deeply in the Houseplant Masterclass, and then you'll start to be able to get an eye for what those deficiencies are and be able to, try to resolve it with a specific type of fertilizer. So for instance, if there's a calcium deficiency within your plant, which again, I've actually gone over that some plants grow in limestone areas like some of my Hoyas, and I started to sprinkle some oyster shells, or in some cases, if you have crushed eggshells, this is a great organic slow release fertilizer that you could use and will mimic a little bit more of the calcium within limestone, and that could actually help make the plant grow better because it's a little bit more akin to the environment that it's used to growing in. So what are some of those other times that you should not be fertilizing your plant? And one of those is the dormancy season. So if you're somebody who lives in the Northeast, like myself, in the winter is usually the dormant month for most of your plants. They are not growing as quickly as you would want them to grow when it's spring, summer, and even fall. Additionally, I do have to say that some succulents actually go dormant in the summer, so the really hot and dry months. So I actually find that some of my plants lose their leaves in the summer months and they start growing them again in the fall and winter months. So then your fertilizing regime would actually be reversed. So its growing season is typically in the dormant season for most of your other foliage plants, for example. So that is something that you need to look out for. And I go through dormancy in a lot of different genera of succulents in my Houseplant Masterclass, which you could refer to as well. What are some of the other times that you shouldn't be fertilizing your plant? Well, when it's dying, when it's going in its dormancy, and if you haven't watered it. So you wouldn't want to go in with your plant and just dump the fertilizer bottle on dry soil. Again, that's going to cause the same types of problems that if you only superficially watered it with fertilizer, and it would actually start to burn the plant stem and root, and it could actually affect the plant's overall health and maybe even kill it. So that is important. You want to be fertilizing when you're watering the plant, but not all the time when you're watering the plant. Don't necessarily follow Bonnie's advice of fertilizing it every time you water your plant. That will be a surefire way to also kill your plant. And finally, I have a great question here by Isla Lamo. I'm worried about over-fertilizing my plants. How do I know if they already have fertilizers mixed in when I purchased them? And I think that is such a great question and one that we often don't think of. I usually tell folks not to fertilize their plants at least for 4, 5, or 6 months after they purchase the plant from the garden center or the nursery or the plant shop. And the reason for that is largely because that plant probably already has fertilizer. Those growers want to grow their plant out really quickly. They are giving them optimum conditions, like they are ready for the Olympics before they get into the garden center or the nursery because they want you to buy their plant. And so they probably have been giving that plant a ton of fertilizer. Then you bring it home and you're not giving it optimum conditions any longer. You're giving it a little bit more of like McDonald's. And that plant is going to have all this extra fertilizer in the soil, and it's not going to be able to take it up as quickly because it's not growing as quickly as it was in the greenhouse or the nursery before it actually got to you. So I usually advise people to hold off on fertilizing that plant at least for the next 4 to 5 or 6 months. And then if it's in its dormancy season after that 4, 5, or 6 months, then you don't need to fertilize it at all for that year until the growing season starts again. And it will have probably then exhausted the fertilizer. So sometimes you'll see or notice these kind of colored, almost plastic looking balls. They might be like blue or green or yellow. It really depends on the color. But those are usually slow release fertilizers. Those are fertilizers that kind of break up over time, and they could be both organic or synthetic fertilizers. For example, these little vermicompost sticks that you stick right into the soil, which I could do actually for this one. I will do that for this right here, and I'll just stick that right down into the soil. And that will start to dissolve over time, and probably over the course of 2 to 4 months would be my guess. If you buy those fertilizer sticks, I will also say it's better to go the organic route, because having those little synthetic fertilizer sticks, again, that is a lot of salts and nutrients in one little stick. And if you're sticking that right next to your plant in only one location, then you're basically having this quick buildup of salts on your plant. So I would highly recommend that if you're going to go the stick route with a slow release fertilizer, that you're using an organic version. So I really hope that's helped you demystify fertilizing. And remember, it is so important to be able to get on a schedule to fertilize your plants, especially as you start to acquire more of them in your life. They are going to really appreciate those extra added lifts of micro and macronutrients that you're giving them, and you will only be benefiting in return with lush foliage and beautiful blooms.
If you have other questions when it comes to fertilizing, then feel free to ask them in the comments below. And if you've been enjoying these Houseplant 101 Back to Basics episodes, then let me know by giving these videos a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. It helps other houseplant lovers like you find Plant One On Me and videos like this. And remember, you could always follow my personal journey on my Instagram at Homestead Brooklyn and on my blog at homesteadbrooklyn.com.